Imagine, what happens when a simple farmer stands against the most powerful HOA president in town? This single question spread like wildfire across community groups, social media pages, and even local news outlets. People from nearby towns leaned closer to the story, eager to know how an ordinary man living a quiet, rural life ended up challenging an entire system built on rules, fines, and absolute control. On the edge of a wealthy neighborhood called Shadow Creek, a quiet farmer lived on his ancestral land. His mornings were filled with the sound of roosters crowing, the smell of fresh soil, and the loyal presence of his dog, who guarded every inch of his property. He was a man of simplicity, someone who believed in hard work, honesty, and the right to live freely without interference. But across the fence line, Shadow Creek told a very different story. Gleaming houses lined perfectly cut streets. Lawns were trimmed with ruler-like precision. Every mailbox looked the same. And at the center of it all was Grace, the formidable president of the Shadow Creek Homeowners Association. With a clipboard always in her hand, Grace carried an authority that most residents feared. To her, order was not just important, it was absolute. The farmer and Grace were two opposites who had never spoken, until one sunny afternoon changed everything. Grace appeared at the farmer's gate, clipboard in hand, her eyes scanning his property like a hawk. She claimed she had received reports of unregistered Airbnb rentals, unapproved buildings, and even livestock that violated community codes. Her words were sharp, her tone unquestionable. With the confidence of someone used to obedience, she demanded to step onto his land for inspection. The farmer, leaning on his wooden gate, listened patiently. His eyes, calm yet steady, revealed no fear. When she paused, expecting him to step aside, his reply was firm. "Ma'am, this land is mine. It does not belong to Shadow Creek, and you have no right to walk beyond this gate." Grace's face stiffened. No one had ever told her no. She reminded him of HOA authority, of rules and regulations. But the farmer didn't raise his voice, didn't argue. He simply repeated, "This property stands free of your association. Please leave." For a moment, silence hung between them. Her clipboard clutched tightly, his dogs watching from behind the fence, and the invisible line of independence drawn clearly in the dirt. Grace finally turned away, but her pride had been wounded. As she walked back to her neighborhood, anger burned brighter than the afternoon sun, and so the seeds of conflict were sown. The farmer returned to his fields, believing the matter was over. But deep in Grace's heart, a storm was gathering. She was not used to resistance, and she would not let this quiet man stand in the way of her control. After Grace's first visit, the air around Shadow Creek shifted. Residents whispered quietly during morning walks and evening porch gatherings. Some admired the farmer's courage to stand against Grace, while others worried about what her anger might bring. The farmer, however, paid no mind to the chatter. His focus remained on his land, mending fences, tending crops, and caring for his animals. To him, life was about work and peace, not power. But Grace was not a woman to let things slide. Days later, she returned, this time with more confidence and determination. She carried a thick folder of papers filled with rules, citations, and printed complaints. Standing at the farmer's gate once again, she began listing one accusation after another. Unauthorized structures, excessive noise from gatherings, livestock violations, and suspicion of illegal rentals. Her voice was sharp, rehearsed like a courtroom lawyer. The farmer leaned against the wooden post, arms crossed, listening quietly. When she finished, he answered with steady words. "Grace, none of what you say applies here. This land has been in my family for generations. It doesn't fall under your HOA or your codes. What you're asking for is control where it doesn't exist." His refusal only fueled her frustration. She tapped her clipboard and said, "If you refuse inspection, I will file reports. You can't simply live outside the order of Shadow Creek." The farmer's dogs barked from behind him, sensing the tension. He raised a hand gently to calm them, then spoke with firm calmness. "You have no authority here. If you set foot beyond this gate without my permission, you will be trespassing." The weight of those words hung heavy. Grace's face stiffened once again, but this time she left quickly, turning on her heels before he could say more. As she disappeared into the neat rows of Shadow Creek, the farmer knew this was far from over. In the days that followed, the conflict deepened in subtle ways. Notices from the county appeared in the farmer's mailbox. Strange inspections scheduled, complaints filed, questions raised about his land. Though none of them held legal weight, it was clear who stood behind them. Grace was trying to wear him down with pressure, hoping he would give in. Yet, instead of breaking, the farmer grew more resolved. He posted new signs at every entrance. Private property. No trespassing. He reinforced his fences and adjusted his cameras. His land had always been open and welcoming, but now it stood guarded, like a fortress protecting not just soil and crops, but freedom itself. Meanwhile, inside Shadow Creek, rumors spread like wildfire. Some neighbors shook their heads at Grace's obsession, whispering that she was taking things too far. Others believed she was defending community standards. The divide between loyalty and doubt grew, setting the stage for a much larger clash. Grace, however, sat in her office late at night, reviewing the papers on her desk. To her, this was no longer about rules. It had become personal. She would not rest until she set foot onto that land. And the farmer, though calm on the surface, knew in his heart that her persistence was dangerous. A line had been drawn, and sooner or later, one of them would cross it. The days that followed were quiet, but not peaceful. The farmer went about his work as usual, feeding his animals, walking the fields, repairing fences, yet an invisible weight hung in the air. He had faced storms before, both in weather and in life, but something about Grace's determination felt different. She was not simply enforcing rules. She was fighting for control, and she was not about to give up. Each evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, the farmer would check his gates and review the footage from his cameras. His land had always been a place of openness, where neighbors could stop by and share a glass of iced tea or trade produce. But now, trust had been replaced with caution. Signs declaring private property, no trespassing, were posted clearly at every entrance. His dogs, once roaming freely with playful energy, had grown alert and protective, sensing their master's unease. Meanwhile, Shadow Creek buzzed with rumors. Some residents admired the farmer's stand, whispering that Grace had finally met someone she couldn't control. Others defended Grace, saying she was only trying to protect the neighborhood's image. The community that once stood in lockstep behind its president was beginning to fracture. Yet Grace herself seemed blind to the growing doubts. To her, every conversation was about restoring order. One afternoon, while the farmer repaired a section of his barn, he noticed something unusual. A car parked along the edge of his property, lingering too long. Through the glare of the windshield, he caught a glimpse of Grace, clipboard resting on her lap. She wasn't bold enough to approach again just yet, but she was watching. He wiped his hands on a rag, met her stare with calm defiance, and returned to his work. Minutes later, the car drove away. That night, the farmer sat on his porch, his dogs lying close by. He thought of his father, who had once told him, "Land is more than soil, son. It's freedom, and freedom is always worth guarding." Those words echoed in his mind. He knew he could go to court, file a complaint, or confront Grace directly. But something told him she was planning more than paperwork. Inside her home, Grace pored over her files. She had tried notices, warnings, and intimidation, but none of them had shaken the farmer. To her, his refusal was a personal insult, a challenge to the authority she had built within Shadow Creek. She tapped her pen against her clipboard, her eyes narrowing. If he would not open the gate, she would find another way in. The tension grew, like two storms slowly building on opposite horizons. The farmer strengthened his fences, checked his locks twice, and kept his dogs close at night. Grace, on the other hand, grew restless, her pride pushing her toward a decision that would change everything. Neither of them knew it. But the fragile line drawn between independence and control was about to be crossed. And once crossed, there would be no turning back. The night before it happened, the farmer left town for a short trip to visit family. He locked his gates, secured his barn, and left his dogs to watch over the land. The property was quiet, yet alive with its usual rhythms, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the barking of dogs echoing across the fields, the solitude of a home that stood proudly independent. But to Grace, this was her chance. She had been waiting, watching, and planning. To her, the farmer's absence meant opportunity. With her clipboard tucked under her arm and determination burning in her eyes, she parked her car just outside the property line. Ignoring the bold warning signs, private property, no trespassing, dogs on premises, she unlatched the gate and stepped inside. At first, the land seemed calm. She walked briskly across the gravel path, scribbling notes as if preparing a report. The barn, the fencing, even the farmer's porch furniture, everything she saw, she recorded. But the stillness did not last long. From the shadows, the farmer's dogs spotted her. Loyal and fiercely protective, they recognized her as an intruder. A deep growl rolled through the air, followed by sharp barks that echoed across the field. Grace froze. Her confident stride faltered as the dogs charged forward, their powerful bodies closing the distance. "Stay back!" she shouted, waving her clipboard like a shield. But the dogs didn't stop. They weren't attacking out of cruelty. They were defending the boundaries their master had set. Grace stumbled backwards, panic overtaking her pride. One of the dogs lunged, teeth grazing her arm. She screamed, falling hard onto the dirt. Another dog barked furiously, circling her, as if demanding she leave immediately. The sound of her cries carried into the air. Within minutes, neighbors from Shadow Creek gathered at the property line, drawn by the commotion. Someone dialed emergency services. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder until flashing red and blue lights lit up the farmer's driveway. Paramedics rushed in, pulling the dogs back with careful hands while police officers helped Grace to her feet. She was shaken, her arm injured, her pride shattered. Yet even in pain, her voice carried anger instead of remorse. "These dogs attacked me. That man set them loose on me," she insisted, refusing to admit that she had trespassed. The officers took notes, but their eyes drifted to the warning signs nailed on every post, clearly visible even in the dark. Neighbors whispered among themselves, some shaking their heads, others watching silently as Grace was placed into the ambulance. As the vehicle pulled away, the dogs calmed, sitting near the gate, their duty complete. The land grew quiet once again, but the damage was already done. Word of the incident spread quickly, not just through Shadow Creek, but across town. To some, it was proof of the farmer's independence. To others, it was evidence of Grace's arrogance. But everyone knew one thing. The conflict had reached a point of no return. The courtroom would decide what came next. The courthouse was crowded the morning of the hearing. Curiosity had spread far beyond Shadow Creek. Townsfolk, neighbors, and even strangers filled the benches, eager to witness the clash between the farmer and Grace. What had begun as a quiet dispute at a property line had grown into a story that everyone wanted to see unfold. Grace entered the courtroom first, her arm still bandaged from the incident. She walked with the same clipboard she always carried, as if rules and regulations could defend her. Her expression was one of confidence mixed with injury, certain that the law would punish the farmer for what she claimed was an unprovoked attack. The farmer arrived moments later, dressed simply in a clean shirt and worn boots. He carried no folders, no binders, no papers, just the calm assurance of a man who knew the truth. His presence was quiet, but strong, and his neighbors noticed the way he looked not like a defendant, but like someone who belonged to the land itself. When the proceedings began, Grace wasted no time. She stood before the judge and declared in sharp tones, "Your Honor, I was viciously attacked by this man's dogs while performing my duty to protect the community. He refused me access before, and when I tried to inspect his property, his animals mauled me. This was intentional neglect, if not outright assault." Whispers spread across the courtroom. Some nodded in agreement, while others exchanged skeptical looks. The farmer's lawyer rose calmly. "Your Honor, we have clear evidence to present." Screens lit up with video footage from the farmer's security cameras. The images were undeniable. Grace unlatching the gate despite bold warning signs, walking onto the property without permission, and ignoring the dog's first warnings. The court watched as the dogs defended their ground, barking, circling, and finally lunging when she refused to retreat. Gasps filled the room. The judge leaned forward, his face stern. "Ms. Grace, do you deny that you saw these signs?" Grace shifted uncomfortably. "Those signs don't apply to me. The farmer is part of our community." The judge interrupted, voice sharp. "The footage proves otherwise. This property is not under HOA jurisdiction. You entered unlawfully. The consequences of your trespass fall on you alone." Grace's face flushed red. Her arguments grew desperate, but the weight of the evidence was too great. The farmer remained silent through it all, his steady gaze fixed on the bench, never once showing anger or triumph. At last, the judge delivered his ruling. "The charges against the farmer are dismissed. Furthermore, the court acknowledges the validity of his signs and his right to defend his property. Ms. Grace, your complaint is not only unfounded, but reckless." The room erupted with murmurs. Some residents of Shadow Creek looked away, ashamed. Others felt a quiet sense of relief that the truth had prevailed. The farmer thanked the court, then stepped outside into the sunlight. For him, this was not victory, it was justice. But he knew Grace's anger had not ended. Something deeper had been broken that day, her pride, her authority, and her claim to power, and with that break, the story was far from over. The ruling spread through Shadow Creek like wildfire. Within hours, residents were whispering about what had happened in the courtroom. Grace, once the untouchable president of the HOA, had lost not just a case, but a great deal of her authority. People who had once feared her clipboard and constant citations now began to question whether her power had gone too far. The farmer, however, wanted no revenge. When reporters asked if he would sue for damages or press charges for harassment, his answer was calm. "All I want is peace on my land." Instead of retaliation, he filed for a restraining order. The judge granted it immediately, forbidding Grace from coming within a set distance of his property. For the first time in years, the farmer felt a measure of safety. His dogs roamed the yard with their tails high, no longer tense with the scent of intrusion. The land, once threatened by interference, stood protected both physically and legally. He returned to his work, plowing fields, tending animals, and watching the sunrise with gratitude. Grace, however, faced a different reality. The HOA board called an emergency meeting the following week. Seated in the grand community hall, board members who had long supported her now shifted uneasily in their chairs. The evidence shown in court had humiliated the neighborhood. Residents worried that her reckless actions had stained Shadow Creek's reputation. When the meeting ended, the decision was clear. Grace would be temporarily removed from her position as president. She sat stiffly as the announcement was made, her fingers gripping her clipboard until her knuckles whitened. For someone who had lived to enforce rules, losing her authority was like losing her identity. News outlets picked up the story, framing it as a clash between rural independence and overreaching HOA control. Headlines highlighted the farmer's dignity and the lesson of respecting private property. Online, the story became viral, sparking debates in forums and neighborhood groups across the country. Some people saw the farmer as a hero standing against tyranny. Others criticized Grace's arrogance. Either way, the story grew larger than Shadow Creek itself. For the farmer, the attention was both surprising and unwanted. He never sought fame. Each evening, he sat on his porch, dogs resting at his feet, quietly watching the world turn. Yet there was comfort in knowing that the truth had reached beyond his fences. In Shadow Creek, the mood shifted. Neighbors walked with less fear, less worry about citations for trivial matters. Some even began visiting the farmer, offering kind words, baskets of fruit, or simply gratitude. The divide Grace had created began to heal slowly. Still, she lingered in the shadows, watching from her windows as the farmer carried on without her interference. The fines weighed on her, the restraining order bound her, and the silence from her community stung deeply. For Grace, losing power was more painful than her injured arm, but for the farmer, peace was not just restored, it was defended. He had proven that independence could withstand intrusion, that truth could silence control. Yet even as the dust settled, he knew human pride had a way of resurfacing, and he wondered if Grace's story had truly ended. For weeks after the courtroom battle, the air around Shadow Creek felt different. The once iron grip of the HOA had loosened. Neighbors who had lived under constant surveillance, worried about the length of their grass, the shade of their shutters, or the size of their holiday decorations, suddenly breathed easier. Without Grace patrolling the streets with her clipboard, the neighborhood felt more like a community and less like a military camp. The farmer noticed the change, too. On weekends, he saw families smiling more freely as children played in their driveways. There were no warning letters tucked into mailboxes, no quiet whispers of fines being threatened. Even though his land lay beyond the jurisdiction of the HOA, he felt the ripple of freedom spread across the fence line. For the first time in months, peace seemed possible. The restraining order kept Grace away from his property. Still, her presence lingered in the shadows, sometimes in the form of gossip, other times in the occasional glare when their paths crossed in town. She had been fined heavily, her reputation damaged, and her authority stripped away by the board. Yet her pride refused to surrender. She lived in the same neighborhood but carried herself differently now, isolated, defensive, and increasingly avoided by the very people she once commanded. Meanwhile, the farmer found unexpected support. Strangers drove past his land just to glimpse the fields where the battle of freedom versus control had been fought. Some stopped by with handshakes and words of admiration. "You stood up for all of us." Others mailed letters, telling him how his story gave them courage to question unfair authority in their own communities. Though humbled by the attention, the farmer remained the same man he had always been. His days still began at dawn, with the crow of roosters and the soft glow of sunlight across his crops. His dogs ran happily across the fields, more loyal than ever, keeping their masters safe. To him, the land was more than soil, it was a legacy, a gift from the generations before him, and a promise to the generations yet to come. But even as peace settled in, he could not ignore the lessons the conflict had revealed. He understood now that freedom was fragile, and that pride could drive people to dangerous lengths. Grace had not simply wanted control. She had wanted recognition, dominance, and the satisfaction of bending others to her will. Her downfall was not caused by the farmer's defiance alone. It was caused by her refusal to respect boundaries, both legal and human. In the months that followed, the HOA board restructured itself. New leaders emerged, promising to focus less on punishment and more on fostering community spirit. A garden club was formed. Neighbors began hosting friendly gatherings, and the atmosphere of fear slowly transformed into one of cooperation. The farmer watched all of this with quiet approval, content to know that sometimes one act of resistance could spark change in ways no one expected. Grace, however, faded into silence. Her clipboard was no longer seen in the streets. Her voice no longer carried in board meetings. Though she remained in her home, she became a figure of caution, a reminder of how unchecked pride could unravel even the strongest positions of power. One evening, as autumn settled over the land, the farmer sat on his porch with his dogs curled at his feet. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke from nearby chimneys. The sky, painted with streaks of orange and gold, reflected the quiet satisfaction of a man who had endured conflict without losing himself. He thought of his father's words once more. Land is more than soil, son. It's freedom, and freedom is always worth guarding. The words had carried him through every confrontation, every sleepless night, and every challenge. They were not just advice. They were the truth. Looking out across his fields, he smiled. Peace had returned, not only to his land, but to his heart. And while Grace's story had ended in bitterness, his had ended in strength. The lesson was clear for anyone who cared to see it. Authority must always bow before justice, and freedom cannot be taken by force. As darkness fell and stars filled the sky, the farmer rose from his chair and walked back into his home. Tomorrow would bring new work, new sunrises, and new days of quiet living. But deep down, he knew his story would live on, not just in Shadow Creek, but wherever people believed in the simple power of standing firm. And so the tale closed where it began. A man, his land, his dogs, and the unshakable truth that some boundaries should never be crossed. Ending words. In the end, the farmer did not just defend his land, he defended freedom itself, and in that victory, peace was restored forever.